Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Dr. Volodymyr Ishchenko, a sociologist from Ukraine, currently at the Institute for East European Studies, Freie Universität Berlin. His research focuses on protests and social movements, revolutions, radicalization, right and left politics, nationalism, and civil society. He has published widely on contemporary Ukrainian politics, the Euromaidan revolution, and the ensuing war. He has been a prominent contributor to Guardian, Al Jazeera, New Left Review, and Jacobin. He is the author of Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War, published by Verso in 2024. I welcome Volodymyr Ishchenko to Savage Minds. In your paper, Post-Soviet Vicious Circle, Revolution as a Reproduction of a Crisis of Hegemony, you discuss how the post-Soviet transformations have not exemplified a progressive process, a quote, progressive process of democratization or decolonization, nor merely cyclical reproductions of patronal regimes. End quote. And you go on to discuss how these post-Soviet transformations can simply not uphold any sort of Gramscian theory set to a post-Soviet context, such as that, I can't see. In your paper, Post-Soviet Vicious Circle, Revolution as a Reproduction of a Crisis of Hegemony, you discuss how the post-Soviet transformations have not exemplified a, quote, progressive process of democratization or decolonization, nor merely cyclical reproductions of patronal regimes, end quote. And you go on to discuss how these post-Soviet transformations can simply not uphold any sort of Gramscian theory set to a post-Soviet context, such as that of a passive revolution whereby ruling elites manage societal change by enacting reforms from above to incorporate and neutralize popular demands. You write, quote, instead, post-Soviet transformations have manifested an unwinding spiral of escalating, expanding, and mutually reinforcing crises of hegemony and counter-hegemony, rooted in the degeneration of the Soviet social revolution, end quote. And you go on to make the claim that Ukraine's 2014 Euromaidan, quote, not only reproduced the counter-hegemonic weakness of the subaltern classes, but also triggered processes of polarization along non-class cleavages and the asymmetrical empowerment of relatively privileged and better organized groups and political actors in the public sphere who neither represented the inflated aspirations of the Maidan protesters nor society as a whole. These dynamics escalated, destabilizing processes that were ultimately exploited by Putin in launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The post-Soviet vicious circle of deficient revolutionary and conservative responses contributed to a new phase in the downward spiral of the counter-hegemony crisis, far beyond the post-Soviet region itself. End quote. Could you please discuss the importance of counter-hegemonic narratives in the post-Soviet era and how the privileged and better-funded groups were utilized by various actors from Putin to those in the U.S., and I'm thinking most notably of Victoria Nuland?
Thank you so much for the summary of our argument in this forthcoming paper on post-Soviet vicious cycle. Well, that's quite a lot of questions in one of them, but well, just to respond to this briefly, I think that the issue of decline of social revolutions is fundamental to understand the current crisis, because it's in part it's also the crisis of a revolution. It's the crisis of our incapacity to organize and politically lead the fundamental radical alternative to the well, to the world order in decline and in collapse. That's that the protests that are erupting in many parts of the world, not just in Ukraine, and we need to look at Ukrainian Euromaidan also in this context, in the context of the Arab Spring, in the context of the populist mobilizations in Western countries, in the context of revolutions, wars, protest waves in many other parts of the world. And despite all of that, despite quite considerable political upheaval, we do not see the emergence of a better alternative. So the world is sliding at an accelerating tempo into a deeper crisis, and obviously the right wing upsurge, the accelerated number of wars, of like economic decline, are different manifestations of this process. And behind that is that we can protest, we can remove the governments like in Ukraine, but we cannot build a better alternative. The result is that we actually are reproducing and even intensifying the crisis itself. And how it worked in Euromaidan, that one of the latest and the biggest revolutions in the post-Soviet region, and it's also important for our argument. I mean, it's because it's not just my paper, but co-authored with a Russian sociologist Oleg Zhuravlev, that post-Soviet countries were actually the region where it was perhaps the most revolutionary in the sense of the massive protests which were capable to remove the governments. One of the most revolutionary region in the whole world. And in Ukraine itself, this was Euromaidan was the third revolution in the life of just one generation. We had Maidans before in 1990, the so-called revolution on granite, which demanded the independence of Ukraine from the Soviet Union. Then in 2004, against the stolen elections, the Orange Revolution, and then 2014, Euromaidan, which was the biggest, the bloodiest, and most consequential among all of the other post-Soviet revolutions. If you also think about Armenia, Georgia, three revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, and suppressed uprising in Belarus, in Russia itself after their stolen elections in 2011, 2012. And so the people are starting to protest against the government that they perceive as illegitimate, corrupt, and making a decision to abandon the European Association under the pressure of Russia, and also because of the corrupt interests of the President Viktor Yanukovych himself. They move to the squares. They mobilize a big number of people. That process starts to radicalize, but at the same time, the protest it just basically reproduces the very weak capacity of the working class to organize itself around its own interests. So that's a very loose mobilization with very poorly articulated demands, with very weak leadership, where people of very diverse groups are participating, but at the same time, they are not organized as groups. And so, as a result, that moment of political upheaval is being hijacked, is being used by the groups and political agents who are better organized, who are more privileged, who can rely on certain important resources like Western publicity, oligarchic money, the capacity to wage violent protest like the radical nationalists. And so these groups like Western-funded NGOs, supported by the Western governments, radical nationalists who've been prominent in especially in the violent part of the protests, the opportunistic oligarchic groups, specifically Petro Poroshenko, who became the president after Euromaidan revolution, they exploit the protests to push forward their interests and agendas, which are not actually popular in the country. They are not even popular among the protesters themselves, like thinking about neoliberal reforms that the pro-Western NGOs were pushing forward, or pretty ethno-nationalist agenda that radical nationalists on the one side and also oligarchic groups were exploiting to, and which were also not popular in the country. Obviously, the corrupt interests of specific oligarchs, the geopolitical interests of the Western powers, they are not popular, but the protest itself creates an opportunity to push forward these interests. At the same time, the people are thinking that they are actually participating in a revolution, not just in some kind of like protest event, not just in a coup d'etat, not just in any kind of like campaign. They're thinking that, and their thinking is quite vague, but still they expect some significant changes after what happened. But what they get is very far from what they aspire for, even if they cannot articulate it properly. So as a result, we get this reproduction of the crisis, of the detachment between the society and politics, detachment between the interests of the majority, even if they are not articulated and organized, and the actual policies which are conducted as a result of Euromaidan. And this also deepens the crisis of counter-hegemony, of the working class to have an independent, autonomous organization and articulation of its own interests. The left is becoming even more repressed as a result of Euromaidan. It also contributes to the crisis of the local ruling class hegemony. And that's why that astounding victory by Volodymyr Zelensky in 2019, the complete novice in the politics, was capable to win against the representative of the old elites, Petro Poroshenko, with huge support of over 70% in 2019. And that exactly exemplified the shallowness and the disappointment of the people with the old elites, and also their readiness to vote for basically anyone who would be not like them. And for the processes that were actually leading to the destabilization of politics itself, when the Ukrainian state was becoming more dependent as a result of the empowered interests of the pro-Western so-called civil society, radical nationalist Western powers, and incapable to proceed with any sovereign, autonomous politics. Those processes were eventually leading to further destabilization. And there is evidence that, well, Putin was seeing Ukraine as not just a threat, but also as a weakening threat, something that would be easy to attack and impose the agenda he had about our country. And that was the processes that were leading to the invasion in 2022. And then after the invasion started, well, many people were saying that, well, Russians failed and they had to retreat. And so, well, the Ukraine is strong as never before. and consolidated as a nation and so on and so forth. But well, after the 3 and more, almost 4 years of the war right now, we actually see that, well, those initial expectations after the invasion were overhyped, that it was in fact Russians who were underestimated as a result. And there was also a huge overestimation of the Western unity and support behind Ukraine. And that's certainly the factors that have perhaps decided the likely outcome of the war and the situation that we are right now, which was actually not necessarily the any kind of like automatic consequence of just a big country attacking the weak country, because in fact in history there have been many examples when a weaker country, which was indeed fighting a kind of like a national liberation war, were in fact capable to defeat stronger enemies. Vietnam against the United States is one example. Afghanistan is another example. The revolutionary wars, which France and Russia itself in 1917 were waging against stronger coalitions of counter-revolutionary powers, is a different example. In fact, the proper social revolution is in fact typically authoritarian, but a very strong state, which can withstand against the counter-revolutionary threats from abroad. But kind of like deficient revolutions, Maidan kind of revolutions, they do not build a stronger state, even when it faces a very significant foreign threat. It actually produces a weakest state, which fate now fundamentally is decided by the people in Washington or in Brussels before it might be decided by the people in Moscow.
Yes, on the show 2 years ago, in fact, we had an art curator, Aaron Moulton, who discussed something that I was aware of because of my work lecturing for many years in Armenia, and I observed the presence of organizations like the Ford Foundation that had been very strongly embedded within academic and cultural institutions there. Now, one of the things that shocked me most, in fact, was to see how discourses such as gender ideology have been implanted within curatorial and academic practices. There you see the elite classes being educated in gender ideology, while the masses, their counterparts and family members, were barely surviving. So I saw how such ideologies not only were implanted by these NGOs and organizations such as the Ford Foundation, I started to notice how former Eastern Bloc countries had become prey to this sort of ideological predation by think tanks, international organizations, and so forth. In fact, in your book published last year, Towards the Abyss, Ukraine from Maidan to War, you take a critical look in one essay within the book at Andrew Wilson's text, Ukraine Crisis. Now, the thing about Andrew Wilson that got me thinking in relationship to my experience with the implantation of certain ideologies within former Eastern Bloc countries is that in popular and trade publications, unlike academic publications, you do not have to disclose, in most cases, the funding behind your research. So I found it very interesting to note that Wilson is a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, the ECFR, as it's mostly known, which is an organization and a not-for-profit European think tank. But this organization is itself funded by other organizations and governments directly linked to the war industry. And I'll give you a few examples of this and some of the ECFR's funding sources, which in my mind explains the car crash of Wilson's book and the way that his ideological fabrications took hold and found themselves parroted within Western media throughout the last 3 years. For instance, the ECFR's largest institutional supporters are European governments and the European Commission itself, who are the primary financiers of defense expansion in 2025 alone. So you have the European Commission and national governments. In 2025, the Commission significantly ramped up its role as a war project financier, managing the European Defence Fund, which allocated 1.065 billion euros in 2025 alone for collaborative military R&D. Then you have national governments. This is notably funding coming from the foreign ministries of Germany, France, and the UK. These three nations have reached record-breaking military budgets in 2025 alone. For example, Germany's defense spending rose to a record 100 billion this year. Then you have the corporate funders with military interests. Several of ECFR's 2025 corporate partners have significant dual use of direct military applications. Examples: Microsoft, a major ECFR donor that holds multi-billion-dollar contracts with the US and European militaries for cloud computing and AI-integrated battlefield technologies. Nokia, while primarily it's a telecom company, Nokia is deeply involved in 5G and critical infrastructure projects that are increasingly categorized as dual use for both defense and security. Then you have Eni and Equinor, two energy giants that are vital to European energy security, which the ECFR itself frames as a core component of hybrid warfare and defense against Russia. Then you have the philanthropic foundations with defense ties. The Carnegie Corporation of New York is a frequent donor that often shares leadership and board members with major U.S. foreign policy circles that are associated with military interventionism. Then you have the Open Society Foundation, which, while focused on democracy, the OSF has been a vocal supporter of the Security Action for Europe, also known as SAFE, a loan instrument, then also other mechanisms that are used to fund Ukraine's defense throughout the last 3 years. On the one hand, you have Andrew Wilson, whose work is being used as a rationale for war against Russia, and on the other, you have Ursula von der Leyen, who has been successfully pimping out this fear of a Russian invasion. Rearm Europe, for instance, which was rebranded earlier this year because the car crash of Rearm Europe didn't fly. But here in Italy, you have people who clearly see what she's up to, and the masses have been vocal in pushing back. So inasmuch as Europeans are clearly against military action in Ukraine or against Russia, many are powerless to stop what seems to be a well-orchestrated political coup of the EU elite classes, who also have been buttressed by legacy media that acts as their press office. So I mentioned the funding of the ECFR because what I've noticed are the various pyramid schemes between power and money that plump up many of the narratives that are completely unpopular amongst Europeans. In your book, you observe, for instance, where oligarchic classes fail to provide stable governments, class struggle lends another means of framing this conflict as part of a broader struggle. You historicize the violence in Ukraine to suppress social conflicts in Russia and Belarus, rooted in entrenched class structures and inequality. And you also challenge Wilson's rather simplistic good versus evil views, offering instead a Marxist-influenced perspective that dissects the material forces and state interests. You also address the neoliberal factors driving the war. And lastly, you get at neoliberalism, which I would argue plays a huge role in this conflict, as it does in my own observations, most every other conflict since 9/11, as the left has been fragmented, even cannibalized by neoliberalism, a point to which we might return later. In your book, you also examine why revolutions like Maidan haven't led to radical social transformation. In part, from what you've just mentioned, you also highlight the limited capacity of subordinate classes to organize for genuine change. So I would wonder, to what degree capitalism is successfully chipping away at the working class's ability to organize, since we are now, as a world culture, stuck online, organizing, isolated, siloed, believing that social media is social when we know it's anything but. In fact, it's quite antisocial. Furthermore, Social media has been successful in getting people to believe falsely that sharing and liking is a revolutionary act. And of course, governments also love this because they don't have to worry about how many people they need to kettle on the streets, right? They don't have to call out the armed forces or the police, and governments don't want to spend money on people protesting for workers' rights, for housing. They want people arguing over pronouns. That's easy to control. So I was wondering if maybe now you could talk about where your article leads up to your book, and if you could discuss why you chose Andrew Wilson's Ukraine crisis while also criticizing the post-Soviet crisis, wherein you argue that the current war is a manifestation of a prolonged demodernization and a crisis of leadership within post-Soviet states.
The book towards the abyss is a collection of essays that I've been writing since 2014 for different publications. And well, it was Perso who approached me and suggested to publish them in as a collection. Because, well, it was also quite interesting that you could write the texts who've been which could stand in their arguments despite all of the well, changes of context, despite all of those events that have been happening in since 2014, not just in Ukraine or Russia, but across the world. And well, you read them. What I've been writing, for example, for Guardian in 2014, the analysis of Euromaidan, what was happening there, and that review of Andrew Wilson's book, which was published also very quickly in 2014, one of the first, I think the first book focused on Euromaidan and the starting war in Donbass, which he prepared probably very kind of like very quickly, and those arguments, perhaps with the exception of some mistakes, but they still stand, and it's kind of like I found it quite extraordinary, and it was important to collect them and to try to present the arguments which were, and obviously my own thinking was also developing since 2014, but still it's possible to say that, well, all those texts, they were built into the very distinct narrative and analysis of the conflict, which tried to focus on the material forces in conflict in the post-Soviet countries. And here where the argument about class conflict, which stands behind the Russia-Ukraine war, is rooted in the class conflict between so-called political capitalists, the dominant fraction of the ruling class in the post-Soviet countries, and transnational capital allied with the local professional middle classes. And the arguments which are also anti-nationalist and go against a very strong tendency to analyze the war and the preceding events, Euromaidan, not just only that, through the lines of very particularistic ethno-nationalist narratives. Basically, this kind of like becomes a sort of like teleological story. Ukraine has been suppressed by Russia for centuries. You might start this history not just in the 20th century, but you might go to the 17th century, you might go even earlier. Putin starts his story from, well, the 9th century, but well, Ukrainian nationalists are starting their story of the war just a few centuries later, in fact. And then you get a story of the struggling and emerging nation, very primordialistic, very ethno-nationalist. And war in 2022 becomes kind of like the culmination of this story, when the nation was capable to repel the invasion, and well, it's kind of like the Ukrainians became the nation like everyone else, and then they typically build parallels with the 19th century nation building processes, or in the 20th century were more progressive parts making connections to the global south and to the anti-colonial national liberation revolutions, so that remains quite a marginal story so far. But that's also it's also quite obvious how intellectually shallow this analysis, and how all those parallels are just falling apart when you start seriously compare Ukraine and Cuba, Ukraine and Vietnam, or Ukraine and Palestine, for example. And on the other side, the let's say this realist analysis of Russia conflict with NATO, which also typically tends to be quite shallow. It just doesn't go in deeper into the precise issue. What is it about between Russia and NATO? And it requires much more unpacking, because it's not just the military part of that thing, but also political economic issue. Just recently, I think just 2 days ago, they published this transcripts of conversations between Vladimir Putin and George W. Bush. They had in 2001, 2005, and 2008. And the like word by word transcript, what they were talking about. And when you start to read those transcripts from the beginning, you see that actually the origins of the Russia-NATO conflict is not about inclusion of Ukraine into NATO. It's not about inclusion of any other country into NATO, but it's primarily about Russia's exclusion from that process. They were excluded. And then it becomes a question, what kind of like alliance they are building after the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And why Russia cannot join it? And what its goal? And if Russia is not joining, what they're going to do about NATO? And to think about what a potential Russia joining into NATO, it would require either NATO itself would be profoundly changed, and in particular became more balanced. And now we see what NATO is worse off when United States cannot be relied on after second Trump elections. Not much. Or Russia should have been profoundly changed. And that gets us to that class conflict between local political capitalists and transnational capital. Russia should have been run by a reliable, dependent comprador elite that the West could rely on in caring for Russia's nuclear arsenal, and also probably for Russia's natural resources. And so if Russia proceeded with the post-socialist transformation the way as Eastern Europe did, without creating that class of political capitalists, Russia could have joined NATO perhaps earlier than Poland, because that would be, they would need a security structure for the interests of the transnational capital coming into Russia. But that didn't happen. And so, well, the analysis which I'm building on, and which implicitly was certain elements were building since 2014, is in a way to offer a materialist argument, a cosmopolitan global argument, not just the reproduction of particularist ethno-nationalist stories. And the argument which connects our crisis, our wars, to what is happening in the whole world. because in fact, the argument which is even more explicitly made in the post-Soviet vicious circle paper is that the what we see in the post-Soviet region is a kind of like a magnifying glass to the global problems, to where the escalation of the current crisis may lead to the bloody wars that are probably expecting us in the future in other places, fought with perhaps even more deadly weapons. But that's where we are coming from. We are coming to, quite likely, unless we'll find a way to organize ourselves on the global scale to prevent the deadly escalation of the violence, and also to prevent the climate catastrophe. All of that actually requires some global political coordination that either the ruling class will be capable to provide, or that something should definitely be on the agenda of the left, of the political forces that might be potentially working on the organization and articulation of the interests of the subaltern classes on the global scale, and potentially maybe leading to a future social revolution.
We just ran a piece yesterday on the ICC judge Nicolas Guyot, who has been depersoned because of his work making decisions as part of his job as an ICC judge regarding a tribunal on the genocidal actions by Israel in Gaza. And we have witnessed similar draconian methods used against journalists like Julian Assange, who was persecuted for years and imprisoned unjustly for his journalism. Then you've got the banning of Varoufakis in Germany, again for his criticism on speaking about the genocide in Gaza. Then more recently, you have a former Swiss military colonel who has been blacklisted, debanked, depersoned, Jacques Beau. You also have the recent story of Special Rapporteur for the UN, Francesca Albanese, who has similarly been debanked and depersoned for her criticism of Western support of the genocide in Gaza, in addition to her criticism of Israel. And as you know, in order to organize, either on the left or the right, organization requires money. These mechanisms that were and are behind the funding of certain kinds of narratives, as I pointed out in my earlier question, how the military-industrial complex is funding the very organizations that fund the people who, like Andrew Wilson, get to speak, who get published, who get time on major news media. Who gets heard on NBC? Who gets heard on MSNBC or the Washington Post? Who's quoted in the New York Times? Which narratives are heard? Because as I'm sure you know, people are not hearing a lot about John Mearsheimer or Jeffrey Sachs. So the people who've hosted Mearsheimer, for example, are in a way less and less mainstream. The mainstream news cycle is in fact bringing out a kind of criticism that has been completely curated in order to distract from more legitimate analyses. How can the left organize, therefore, when in a heartbeat they can be defunded?
First, I will just say that me and Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs are not giving exactly the same arguments. That's part of, in fact, of my analysis and of my criticism of that. What I think is pretty shallow geopolitical analysis. We need to go deeper, and part of the text included towards the Abyss collection, in fact, are criticizing this kind of like simplistic analysis of NATO-Russia conflict. But to say about the question of money and the institutions that give more prominence to the narratives which serve the interest of the ruling class and the marginalized alternative narratives, what are we even expecting them to do? Should those institutions should promote social revolution and like a real working class organization? Probably not. And that's not, and in essence, it becomes not just a question of money. That, well, the big foundations that started by billionaires, or the governments which are run by the political representation of the billionaires, are not supporting the left. If you think about the history of the left, starting from the origins of the socialist movement in the 19th century, the socialist movement was at its strongest in the end of the 19th century, in the beginning of the 20th century, and later, before it went into the crisis. Also, in particular, as a result of the Soviet Revolution degeneration. But when we were the strongest, it was not because we had like some powerful donors who gave us money and who gave us prominence in the press, which was published by the billionaires. It was because of our organization, because of our capacity to really lead the masses of the workers, because of the millions of people who were not expecting some grants from foundation, but who were actually donating, who were paying the fees to the unions, to the parties, to sustain the big counter-hegemonic apparatus of the socialist movement. So that's the issue. That's the issue that we cannot solve right now. And that's especially acute issue in the Eastern Europe, where in fact the coming of the Western foundations to the region were also connected to with a way of corrupting the let's say liberal progressive intellectuals and initiatives, which has been remaining small, which has been remaining dependent on the foreign funding, and becoming not necessarily more connected and stronger as a result of the money coming from abroad. And in the way they were, in the most well, extreme cases, well, in particular, like in Ukraine, also in Georgia, foreign funding creates basically a social class of people who make their income primarily from the grants of the Western foundations. And then they acquire very specific interests. They acquire very specific ideologies. And even when they are nominally on the left, they are not crossing any of the red lines of the that are becoming especially important when the wars are starting, when certain massive protests are starting, like Euromaidan. So you need to stand in the line. You cannot kind of like offer the serious criticism of what is happening, because that criticism would go against the interests of your whole class of people. And that's a problem. And that's a problem that we are in our region have to deal with and have to overcome. And so far, not so successfully, but however, as a result of in particular, of the crisis of the EU, of the crisis of the US aid, all those problems have been brought to the fore of the discussion, and there have been a number of more and more critical publications on the whole process and how it doesn't actually help to build a genuine civil society in our countries, but rather to corrupt middle-class intellectuals.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. Yes, this is something I also observed in Armenia, which I find quite interesting, especially in the time following the fall of the Berlin Wall and in the post-Soviet era. There was ample opportunity there for think tanks to emerge, and maybe we ought to even consider putting think tanks in air quotes. And I suggest this because many of these think tanks and foundations were operations that took place for ideological capture, effectively. Yet much of what we are told via legacy media about let's say, Ukraine and Russia, is based almost entirely upon former Soviet bloc nations having been shown what they need to know about democracy and the values of democracy and capitalism. And there's been an entire ideological battle waged by NGOs, think tanks, and the like. You mentioned, for instance, just now that you don't agree with Sachs or Mearsheimer, and that was actually part of my next question in terms of how this post-Soviet era NATO has been weaponized by Western forces to see the current situation that Ukrainians are living through, that Russians are also living through, and most especially the many who have been conscripted into this war. How do you view the situation differently from Sachs and Mearsheimer? I might be bastardizing a bit of what they offer, but they broadly agree with each other. Basically, they view the crisis and the ensuing war as having come about because of Western hegemony, namely the US, and later we could even include the UK if what Boris Johnson confesses in his recent autobiography is correct. And I'm referring to his stating that he was directly told to rebuff all forms of negotiation early on in the weeks after the beginning of the war in 2022. That said, Mearsheimer and Sachs seem to view this as a war that is necessarily the result of the refusal of NATO and Western nations to respect agreements that were made as far back as Gorbachev and Yeltsin, namely that NATO would not encroach upon Russian territory to include all countries bordering Russia. You write about this subject in your 7th chapter titled NATO Through Ukrainian Eyes. Could you elaborate your thoughts on this topic to our listeners who are used to either hearing the parroting of Western media that has postured Putin as the next Hitler, or who have been given the countercurrents of Sachs and Mearsheimer?
The problem with Mearsheimer and Sachs analysis that they do not problematize the interests of the ruling classes that are standing behind NATO and Russia conflict. Now we actually see that the Western ruling class is quite fragmented, that Trump and Vance in the United States, they have very different view on NATO and on, well, basically on the world politics than the people who run the European institutions. Within each European country, there are also, well, different fractions of the ruling class. So when they say NATO, when they say the United States, it's actually not clear. And now we see that it's more and more problematic to see them as kind of like a unified interest. It could have been politically unified to a certain extent for a certain period, but now it's kind of like becoming fragmented. And why exactly? And I don't think that either Mearsheimer or Sachs actually have conceptual tools to analyze the divergence of interest within the ruling class itself. In Russia also, the Russian ruling class is also not homogeneous. Putin might be kind of like organizing it in what we call Caesarist or Bonapartist way, primarily by coercion and balancing of interests, but not in a way of like truly hegemonic organization. But within that class, we also see different, big divergence. There are people who are more connected to the military-industrial complex. There are people who are more connected to Putin himself. There are people who, on the other side, they have more stakes in the transnational capital, and so they try to abandon Russian citizenship rather than abandoning those assets that other Russian capitalists had in the West. But they abandoned them because they had much more important within the country, right? So that the interest of the conflict of interest between more like transnational part of the post-Soviet ruling class against more political capitals. And political capitals actually have a fundamental interest in a sovereign state, because if a state is the major provider of competitive advantage for those capitalists, they're interested to have a monopoly control over certain defined territory. And that's what sovereign state is providing. And that is what is endangered by the transnational institutions, including NATO. So the issue with NATO is fundamentally the question of Russia's exclusion. And they wanted to be a part of the global elite, but they wanted to be a part of the global elite on a more or less equal terms. What we see in the transcript of, for example, of the talks between Putin and George W. Bush in 2011, Putin is trying to become an ally of the United States. He mentions that, well, the Soviet Union once applied to NATO, but they were rejected, obviously. But now, why not Russia cannot become part of NATO? And they discuss with George W. the problem with Iran, the problem with North Korea, the problem with Islamic fundamentalism, and so on and so forth. So Russia was kind of trying to present themselves as an important ally in dealing with the issues which were important for the American elites. They were not included, and as I just talked about, because that would require a fundamental change of either NATO or of the Russian state itself. And then it would go against the interests of the transnational capital or the interests of the Russian political capitalists. So that's the issue that I think shallow geopolitical analysis, which doesn't go deeper into the political economy of the conflict, is simply doesn't see, probably doesn't see as important and doesn't have a conceptual tools to analyze. Also, well, when we look inside Ukraine, and you mentioned that article which is included into the Towards the Peace collection, NATO through the Ukrainian eyes, we would see immediately that there is actually a divergence of interests and agendas within Ukraine about NATO. And NATO has even now, but well, in 2022, some people could say that now Ukraine is kind of like united about NATO because Russia attacked and NATO is kind of like a natural protector against Russia. But before 2022, there was a huge divergence of interests and agendas. When in 2008, NATO in Bucharest decided that Ukraine and Georgia would become the members of NATO in future, support for NATO in Ukraine among the population was about 20%. The majority were supporting either neutrality or they were actually supporting joining a military alliance with Russia. This was more like the split of other 80%, more or less equally. In 2008, the anti-NATO political parties could win elections. And even the most popular nominally pro-Western party led by Yulia Tymoshenko, one of the very prominent Ukrainian politicians and oligarchs, she was also anti-NATO, even though she was regarded as kind of like pro-Western. When she was, in fact, probably never was in ideological sense. In 2008, Vladimir Putin himself was the most popular foreign leader among Ukrainians. 59%, according to a poll conducted in February 2008, right on the eve of the Bucharest summit, 59% of Ukrainians were saying that they trust Vladimir Putin. And that was much higher than any of other foreign leaders. Maybe only Belarusian leader Lukashenko, another dictator, could compete in popularity among Ukrainians. And Putin was more popular than any of the Ukrainian politicians. That's just extraordinary. And then you look how which arguments, which interests were driving pro-NATO agenda in Ukraine. So until and that's very interesting systematic study by Irina Zherun, which is going to be published, I think, in January. She just did a very systematic analysis of the parliamentarian discussions about NATO for a very long period, since the 1990s and up until recently, 2018. what different politicians from different parties were saying in defense or against NATO in the Ukrainian parliament. And he just systematically shows that until 2014, until the start of the war in Donbass and until the annexation of Crimea, Russia was, in fact, even for the pro-NATO camp, they made the argument for NATO not because Russia is an imminent threat to us, but because they wanted to join so-called civilization. They wanted to join the club of civilization, basically, fundamentally kind of like an Orientalist, a self-colonizing argument. We want to be basically with the white people, what they meant. And NATO was a part of this, of the discourse. EU, WTO, support from IMF, and also NATO. That was coming like the whole package. And their argument was NATO not as a protection, but NATO is a kind of like a social advancement for Ukraine, because Russia could not offer anything like shiny and bright and promising any European future as well, all these transnational institutions were promising. Of course, since 2014, the situation changed. There was a real act of annexing Ukrainian territory in Crimea, then support for the Russian nationalists in Donbass. And then obviously the support for NATO increased. But even after 2014, Ukrainian public was rather split about NATO. So those who supported pro-Russian integration, they became a small minority. But most of those people did not become pro-NATO. They simply became pro-neutrality. The plague on both of your houses. They didn't trust either the West or Russia. And so the NATO didn't have a solid majority support up until 2022, up until the start of the full-scale invasion. Before 2022, this was more or less split between supporters of NATO and supporters of neutrality. But even after 2022, after this, that immediate upsurge of trust in Zelensky, support of NATO, support of the United States, support of the European Union, which wasn't it kind of like a reality in the first years of the war. But now, and when people actually see that NATO is not exactly a guarantee, especially NATO, which doesn't lack a reliable support from the United States, which Trump just demonstrated that he's not going to spend even 1 cent on Ukraine, and he's ready to sell the weapons, but he's not going to provide them. And then it becomes the question of where to get money to fund the war, the weapons, and also a big part of the Ukrainian state, which became fundamentally dependent on the funding coming from the West. So in this situation, again, the attitudes towards NATO are becoming worse and worse in Ukraine. And so if we just basically need to understand that there is some certain class dynamics. There's the competition of different interests and agendas that stand behind the major geopolitical conflict, but which cannot be simply explained by imposing certain essentialized interests on the West and on Russia. It just doesn't work like that, and it doesn't lead us far in understanding of the war.
Your critique of Mearsheimer and Sachs is understandable, since both men come from a tradition where class is rarely factored into political analysis. In fact, our country is not exactly the most class conscious on the planet, and I would even argue that the United States is probably the least class conscious country on the planet. We're not raised to understand any of the issues behind Marxism or communism, just for starters. We are also not led to understand the Soviet Union's involvement in World War II. For instance, in elementary school through high school, we are told that it was us, the United States, which saved Europe from the Nazis, where Russian presence and the massive sacrifice of the lives of Russians is completely steamrolled in our history books. And this hasn't changed since I was a student. So I don't find Mearsheimer's or Sachs' illusion of class surprising at all. At the same time, we do have the wonderful Adolf Reed, who in his work on neoliberalism argues that the threat of nuclear war in Ukraine is simply a symptom of a world where neoliberalism can no longer provide material security to sustain its legitimacy, which it has done especially since, I would argue, the 1960s and most definitively since the Reagan era. Reed positions the war in Ukraine as part of a rising tide of authoritarian and fascist movements that have emerged when democratic orders failed to deliver for the working class. And I think Reed offers an analysis that goes way beyond that of Sachs and Mearsheimer's. However, this is not being covered by MSNBC or the New York Times once again. And more to the point, we rarely saw any mention of class during our lockdown, a time when Americans were having to decide if they could even eat. So as a Ukrainian living in Germany, you are, I'm sure, aware of how the US is represented in the golden screen of Hollywood versus the reality on the ground. One thing foreigners are rarely prepared for when they come to the US is to see how people live in East St. Louis or even right outside Port Authority in New York City. The homelessness and the hunger that is facing the so-called greatest nation on earth. A lot of people are not aware of this because our media does an excellent job of selling When Harry Met Sally. That's what we do. We cover our economic woes and class disparities with wonderful golden age and more contemporary cinema. So I'm wondering if in your analysis here, you obviously honed in on class, the one thing that Sachs and Mearsheimer don't do, but you are conscious of how class is functioning within the fracturing narratives amidst Ukrainians. So what do you see as the prognosis for the relative future where you have now Trump having washed his hands of the situation in Ukraine after having made his cozy arms deals in exchange for getting out of any kind of direct action in supporting the war? Also related here, we have von der Leyen, who has announced just 2 weeks ago, we're no longer buying gas from Russia here in Europe. Well, this was just a fudge on a deeper lie, because guess what? European nations are now buying Russian petrol, oil, refined gas, what Putin has basically sold to Narendra Modi, discounted Russian crude. Russia sells the crude oil at a significant discount to India that in turn refines this oil into diesel and petrol. Then we buy it from India. But von der Leyen doesn't mention that, nor does she mention the ecological impact of this, right? So it's very interesting how this kind of purity posturing by the EU of washing one's hands of Russia is simply a lie because it's just been subcontracted through India, with Europe buying the Russian byproducts at a far higher price tag, while the working class, of course, suffers this price tag, right? And all this was an exchange with Trump, who was able to not only cash in on deals with the EU, plus mineral deals with Zelensky, who every so often goes to Washington with his hand out asking for more money to fund the war. Here's my question. How do Ukrainians view this? Rather, do they take Zelensky seriously at this point?
That's a very good question about the attitudes of Ukrainians towards Zelensky, because if you look at the surveys, they would still find quite considerable support for Zelensky. In some surveys, it didn't even change since the start of the corruption scandal, which was very recent. And that's a big puzzle. And well, as a sociologist, I would take seriously all the problems with the reliability of the wartime surveys. In particular, the incapacity to survey a big part of Ukrainians because they're refugees or they're in the occupied territories or they're in Russia, and perhaps the fear that some respondents may feel when they are responding to politically sensitive questions. It may also contribute to biased results and so on and so forth. But anyway, we cannot rely on anything else in thinking about in analyzing the what the majority of the population is thinking about different issues, particularly Zelensky. So let's discuss the surveys. And and it's also evident in our own survey, which we commissioned in summer this year the reasons why Zelensky is supported. And Zelensky is supported primarily simply basically out of fear. If Zelensky is removed, then something worse is going to happen. The war is going to be lost. Everything is going to collapse. So Zelensky became a figure that the most of Ukrainians are simply relate to out of fear, and they do not see that's it's a part of the kind of like national defense feeling which is projected to Zelensky. But Zelensky himself cannot offer anything. And so it's probably the explanation for why his personal support doesn't even change when these quite major corruption allegations are made against the people who are very close to him, and who have been even running the country together with him. And I'm speaking about Andriy Yermak, his chief of staff, just recently dismissed as a result of the corruption scandal. And so whatever is happening in internal politics has become less important when Zelensky is something that just keeps Ukraine running, right? To which extent it's gonna continue or may falter at some point. It's difficult to predict, but there is also another indication that the majority of Ukrainians do not want Zelensky to run for the second term, even after the war ends. So when the war ends, they do not need Zelensky anymore. That's something important to consider. And in terms of the future, well, globally, I think we will get even more of the fragmentation, political fragmentation of the ruling classes, more and more conflicts, like we see now between Trump and the EU. EU itself is quite probably in the situation of the fragmentation. And in case of, for example, the victory of right-wing forces in France or in Germany, AfD entering a ruling coalition with Christian Democrats, perhaps, we may see the push towards defund of the European institutions, and maybe not necessarily disbanding in EU itself, but the governments run by these right-wing populists may behave more or less like Orban in Hungary. That I'm not I'm not against, but I'm not going to pay any cent for that. Right? What they were doing with the Czech leader, with the Slovak leader, when they discussed the loan for Ukraine just very recently. So you can give them the loan, but we are not going to pay. And that's something that may happen also with other European institutions and initiatives that require the common funding. And for Ukraine itself, it's kind of like it becomes extremely dangerous. So because the major bet of the Ukrainian government and of this comprador civil society was that the West is going to support them. But the West is becoming fractured and fragmented, and even those forces that may still support them, they not like von der Leyen, they may not necessarily have powers enough to give what Ukrainian government is asking them, and so that's why this loan of 90 billion euros for 2 years, which would not be sufficient to cover even the expenses on the level of the previous years. And continuing the war actually require more expenses, significantly more. And that Ukraine is hardly would be able to find anywhere else. And well, what a big part of Ukrainian elite and probably significant sections of the European elite were hoping for, that Ukraine may probably become something like Eastern European Israel, a militaristic ethno-nationalist state which could be used to outsource European security, to fund the big Ukrainian army, which had a huge experience in fighting Russia, of course, to fund the big military-industrial complex. And, well, European security would be basically done in a big part by Ukraine. And Ukraine becomes, well, in the Roman Empire, there was this concept of federati, the so-called barbarian tribes, which were allowed to settle within the limits of the Roman Empire, precisely in order to protect the limits against other barbarian tribes. And Ukraine kind of like may acquire a role, something like that, of contemporary European federati, defending the limits of the so-called civilization against Russia. But even to do that, there should be some economic conditions, right? There should be a flow of billions to fund that effort. Even more importantly, there are demographic problems because Ukraine is depopulating and has been depopulating even more at accelerated tempo as a result of the war. The projection of the United Nations for the population forecast in Ukraine by the end of the 21st century is 15 million. 15 million down from 52 million Ukraine had in 1992 after the Soviet Union collapsed. So the depopulation of over 70%. It's much bigger than even other countries in Europe, which are also depopulating, but not to that extent. And that means that who is even going to fight in that big Ukrainian army, which is supposed to defend Europe against Russia? Where they're going to fight these people?
Well, this is the question that I think the working class is probably thinking, if not also asking itself, because they observed what happened with the sabotage to the Nord Stream pipeline, or the fact that now the EU is withholding Russian funds. People in Ukraine and Russia see it all, I would imagine, especially the working class, that they are being used, that they are being exploited both economically and in terms of manpower for a war in which they die for the elite to gain economic advantage, right? You mentioned Vietnam earlier. But similar to this war, Vietnam was a war that ended because of class criticism that fundamentally took in its crosshairs the way that the people in the United States started to see the pattern of the classes who call for war versus the class of people whose children were being sent to die in that war. Your thoughts?
Well, that I think it does contribute to the decline of support of Ukraine among the population in Western countries. It did some, as I followed the public opinion surveys in Western Europe and in the United States, there was for a certain period of time there was high support for Ukraine as seen as a victim of aggression, and then, well, for many people it's kind of like almost like natural to support the victim in this situation. But then again, the people are acquiring more sophisticated lenses to look at this war. The people see the divergent interests. The people see who is actually forcefully mobilized to fight in the Ukrainian army. The people see that there is decline of volunteerism in Ukraine. They start to ask questions, what are the people in Ukraine actually dying for? And whether the ethno-nationalist narratives which legitimate the war are actually plausible, and whether Ukrainians themselves believe in that. And what is evident is, for example, that the majority of Ukrainian males are dodging the draft. There is a growing number of desertion and absence without official leave in the Ukrainian army. That high that recently the Ukraine stopped publishing official statistics on the number of cases because it, as I explained, that this has become an issue of the national security. Just like before that, they classified the number of casualties in the war. And and that also brings back to the divergence of the class interests. And when and to continue the discussion about the future, if in fact there are no economic and even demographic conditions to build a strong militaristic state in Ukraine, then what is going to happen? Maybe Ukraine is becoming not something like Israel in Eastern Europe, whatever we think about what Israel is doing. But Eastern European Syria, a failed state, where parts of the territories are controlled by the Ukrainian government, but other parts are controlled by non-governmental movements like ISIS controlled in Syria. And in Ukrainian case, that would probably be radical nationalists who have become stronger as a result of the war and are building their own institutions. Other parts are obviously occupied by the neighboring powers, by Russia primarily, but maybe not necessarily by Russia, because, well, Hungary is also thinking about certain regions in Ukraine where there is concentrated population of Hungarians, and Europeans may think about it, well, entering certain regions of Ukraine are necessary for their own security, and Russia would be actually inviting them to do that because they are interested in dividing Ukraine. And so, and an alternative to that, that might not be necessarily the most likeliest at this moment, but seems to be at least plausible, is becoming something like Georgia. Georgia, also a post-Soviet state, which had its own revolutions in 2003. They brought to power a very pro-Western government by Mikhail Saakashvili. They also had their own war with Russia in 2008, which they lost in 5 days, and which was also connected to the issue of Bucharest summit, NATO, and attempt to take over the territories that Georgia had, that formerly are Georgian, but which seceded in the early 90s, South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And that failed. And since 2012, they are run by the party called Georgian Dream, which organizes the Georgian oligarchs, Georgian political capitalists. And Georgian elite itself starting to accommodate to certain Russian demands, even without abandoning their formal pro-Western course. They still want to join the EU, but maybe they want to join the EU of Orban and Le Pen, not necessarily a liberal EU. And within that, Georgian Dream has been capable to win elections, to withstand against quite considerable protests as a result of the opposition questioning the results of the elections, and the opposition was acquiring a big support from the European Union, but it didn't work. And the government was standing because the Georgian elites themselves, they were not fracturing. They were seeing that the European Union does not present any glorious future. That's something to be to account for, maneuvering between EU, Russia, and also increasingly important China, in particular for in Georgian case. So that's a kind of like a pragmatic maneuvering between the great powers, which still helps to sustain peace and sustain certain development in Georgia. Georgia has been growing economically at considerable tempo, in particular as a result of the war in Ukraine, because Georgia became an important transition path for the goods towards Russia and for other economic flows. But that's something important for Ukrainian elite to consider, that this is a way that perhaps may save as many lives as possible and as much of remaining Ukrainian infrastructure as possible at this moment. And saving what we still have is something that may provide a basis, the conditions for development in future, because no regime in Russia is forever. No American president is forever. And the European Union itself is probably also not forever. But that still helps to save what we have and in order to have the conditions to revive and to develop when the opportunities would be better than they are now.